Welcome back to Active Ingredients, the leadership podcast that explores what really drives success in life sciences. I'm your host, Tom Dove, founder and CEO of Fraser Dove International. Today's guest is Derek McCaig, a commercial strategist and transformation leader who spent his career launching life-changing medicines across some of the most complex corners of healthcare. From the first wave of HIV treatments in the 90s to rare diseases and gene therapy today, Derek's work connects powerful science with purpose-driven teams. He's led national organizations in Big Pharma, helped scale biotech startups, and brought commercial clarity to some of the sector's most emotionally charged breakthroughs. In this conversation, we talk about how to lead at different altitudes, how balance and passion and pragmatism can all come together, and why sometimes the most meaningful wins don't come from the product itself, but from the people and lessons you take with you. Let's get into it. Derek, how are you? Good morning.
Yeah, Tom, delighted to be on the podcast. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes, you and I have had some really cool conversations, and I'm excited to bring this to life today. But as we always do with this podcast, I like to kick things off with the simple question: what do you think are the three key active ingredients in successful leadership, and why?
I think there are lots of answers to that question, but for me, the three things are firstly trust, I suppose. I think it's really important to build trust with your team within the organization. I think a big part of that is also integrity, because I think the more the team sense that integrity and that trust, the more likely they are to be innovative, the more likely they are to take risks, and to deliver performance. I think the second thing then is empowerment, which is, people want to come to work and feel that they make a difference day to day in delivering the outcomes that the organization or your part of the organization is seeking to do. And the more that trust is there, the more empowered they are, the more energy they'll put into that, the more successful you're likely to be. And then I think the third one is, however you call it, problem solving, agility, flexibility. The world around us seems to change at an ever increasing pace, as does the internal worlds in which we operate. And so the ability to adapt to those changes, the things that you couldn't see on the horizon, and still turn that into successful outcomes. I think those three are together really important, and I think they're connected.
Yeah, so do I. That's exactly what I was going to say. Trust, empowerment, problem solving, adaptability, and agility. I think that they are three fantastic active ingredients. Also, I always reframe it in my mind that bad leadership, if you don't have any of those aspects, that is a broken axis and where challenges can creep in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, particularly the trust thing, really underpins everything. And it's not just about trusting the leader, if that's me. I mean, I think about leadership, not just about the team that I'm leading, but also I play a role in a leadership team where I'm with peers, and that trust to work, across that team is really important. And that's where people give up their best, or to put it another way, perhaps when people don't feel that trust and don't feel that integrity, they're just a little more reticent. You have slightly less honest conversations, and probably don't deal quite as effectively with the issues that are in front of you, whether they're good issues or bad issues.
Yeah. And what we'll definitely do is we'll start to talk about leadership, the different roles that you've played, good leadership, not so good leadership a little bit later on. But let's try and give the listeners a bit of an understanding, perhaps, of you in your younger years. Let's see if there's any kind of foundational steps. So, Derek, what were you like at school, university? Did you think that there was always a career destined in life sciences?
Actually, no, it wasn't. It's interesting. My best subject at school was English. The subject that I liked best was history, but I was quite good at sciences. And with history and with English, I couldn't quite see how I would have a career. And then I had a couple of friends of the family. One was a pharmacist, who spoke about, that kind of profession. And I always remember him saying, look, the good thing about pharmacy at university is that you'll come out and you'll be able to get a job. So you talked about pragmatism at the beginning. Well, that was the first step in pragmatism. But also another family friend who I suppose we'd call nowadays a bit of an entrepreneur in life sciences. So he devised and then set up a company to manufacture artificial venous grafts. So where you took chunks of people's veins out and put these artificial ones back in because they had cardiovascular problems. And that kind of, whilst I wouldn't say it was necessarily inspirational, that sense of science being able to do amazing things was, really kind of in the back of my mind. And so the combination of those two things, plus a sense that pharmacy would be a challenge, kind of led me into to doing that degree.
Yeah, fantastic. Because it's quite interesting when you are at university, dependent on which city you're in, um, there isn't as much visibility or access, I suppose, to some of the amazing pharmaceutical or biotech companies that are out there. And it's quite a similar type of conversation that I've had with other guests where you actually see people in your real life rather than through university that have worked in the industry, and they might be that kind of catalyst or inspiration to get you in.
Yeah, that's true. And I think once I was in pharmacy, I worked out fairly quickly that I didn't want to be a pharmacist in a chemist shop. So again, or in a hospital, once you're in there, you begin to think about what the career might look like.
Yep.
And that sense of not wanting to do one aspect of it led me to think a lot more about the industry as a place where there would be opportunity, there would be challenge, there would be interest. And again, that comes back to some of those conversations that I had as a mid teenager, where you go, actually, this might be the avenue to pursue.
Yeah. And what about the entrepreneurial side? So obviously you started in kind of the pharmacist world. Were there any signposts, in your younger years that would bring you into that commercial role, do you think?
Um, I think my school years and my university years were really characterized by determination and hard work. And I suppose at its heart, determination and hard work are about solving problems and taking the next step that you need to take. So, for example, I remember failing my physics and had to go and repeat a year before I could get into university to go and do pharmacy. And that's that kind of resilience, but also finding the solution to the problem, which was to work in a different way than I had been, and to be successful on that basis. And I think, when I left university, the first, you say I worked in pharmacy, well, I did my pre-registration year, which was 6 months in hospital and then 6 months in industry because I had a long-term job in industry. And I think that showed me that, I'd made the right choice, that industry was far more interesting. But then I moved on to my first proper role, which was you can call it entrepreneurial, but in the end, it was about solving some big problems and being thrown in at the deep end to do that.
Yeah, perfect. And I'm really intrigued and interested to talk about your leadership career because, in the conversations that we've had previously, I've really loved your, um, I think the word would be, commitment, trust, love for the industry and seeing it at its best, where sometimes large pharma isn't always viewed in the same way. And I really have enjoyed our conversations around some of that. So let's get into it. When did you first feel like you were a leader in industry?
Um, Actually, it was my first job. So the once I completed my pre-registration year, I was working in manufacturing, and I ended up being given a job on night shift for just over a year. So I worked constantly on night shift, and obviously very few people in the area. And they allocated me a sterile unit that was producing vials, and was a problem for the manufacturing team, because it wasn't completing batches. It was shoving things through the process of and disrupting the manufacturing schedule. And then coupled with that, we had a situation where there was a problem with one of the vials where glass was found in it. So at the age of 21, having just left university, you know, they basically said, well, go and fix it. Um, and again, context is important because that was a team of lovely people, but with no meaningful career ambition. They were there to do a good job, and came to work to do that. Um, but I had to take them with me on that journey and to help them be successful. And I vividly remember the first time I walked into the sterile suite, to get changed to go into the manufacturing area. One of the ladies kind of said, "Well, what are you here to do?" And I just said, "I'm here to get you or get us to finish batches." And she looked at me straight in the eye and said, "Oh, we'll never do that." Um, which, so it's like, okay. So again, that's that leadership thing, which is, well, I believe we can do it. I'm going to help you do it, and I'm going to find a way whereby you can do it. And that's exactly what we did. And we turned that unit around. We could do, perfect filling runs, no breakages, no nothing. And they led some of that work because I began to ask them what their ideas were and how we could change things. And yes, I identified some things that we had to change as well. But ultimately, they became one of the most successful teams, and they actually allocated more and more work to that team in night shift because they were so effective.
What a great start as well. Thrown in the deep end.
Mhm.
And did you have to relocate for the role? Was this in a different part of the UK?
Well, yes, I relocated to Dartford.
Okay.
And so what you and the listeners have to imagine is somebody with a much broader Glaswegian accent than now going into a sterile suite with a mask over their mouth and attempting to communicate with people who spoke very differently. So, but all of those things created a certain amount of fun and enjoyment because they would, take the proverbial out of me, and it really began to build that kind of team-based spirit, if you like. And we worked really well together and had a lot of fun doing it, but really achieved some very important successes as well as achievements for each of us on the team.
Yeah, I love it. And also the interesting thing from the top-down perspective, like you've been given the trust, the empowerment to go and solve a problem within this site in your first role.
Yeah, yeah,
So actually that kind of active ingredients that you spoke about at the beginning, you were given that instantly and then have been able to go and create a varied career, moving out of manufacturing, moving out of night shifts and then into a more commercial world.
yeah. And that was because I really didn't have a great interest in manufacturing. The experience that I had taught me a lot about leadership and working with teams, and I suppose gave me some confidence that I could, be successful as a leader and build a career in the industry. But it wasn't really what interested me, and getting into that commercial world really was always the plan.
Yeah, great. And I'm really keen to talk about that. So, what role do you think, or what leadership challenge do you think was the catalyst of change for you to become, a more focused commercial leader as your career path?
I think the one that was the biggest challenge and probably taught me most about leadership was the role leading the sales force. A couple of hundred people, but that was further down in my career. But I guess you build those experiences, and I think the next role where I went to be a sales representative was also part of that leadership learning, if you like, because I was working at the customer interface. And in a situation you mentioned AZT and HIV. I mean, when I was doing that, that was a brand new disease. The physicians were attempting to understand the disease, and we had a product which had been fast tracked through, the regulatory. We knew very little about it. We had very little data, and that sense of, if not leadership, but responsibility, but also a partnership with the physicians in helping each other learn and if not make decisions, certainly exchanging ideas as to what the best way forward was really important. And I suppose I felt a great responsibility for transmitting the experience of other customers that I was talking to around that community, because they'd always say, well, what's Dr. Such and Such doing, or what does he think of that? And so, there's a tremendous responsibility to communicate that well and openly and transparently, around the community so they could learn.
Yeah, I watched a fantastic TV program on Channel 4 that was based around HIV in the 80s and 90s, where it was, you know, as as you said, a very almost untreatable, people just unsure what was happening. And it was also extraordinarily difficult for doctors, nurses to get an understanding. So to be in that moment, um, you know, you and I have spoken of seeing the industry at its best. Can you explain a little bit more about kind of how you led through that time and how you inspired other people within the organization to take on the challenge?
Yeah, I think a lot of that was sharing experience. I think can really lead in colleagues, other representatives. We didn't have teams in those days, so you'd have to find ways to share that experience, and say that we've been able to do this in my patch, because this happened and they've learned that, and really that was, I think, really important for the whole community at that point. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that even though there was a medicine to help treat the disease, it wasn't necessarily received with open arms and great joy. It had its limitations for sure, and the whole community at that point was, frankly outraged. That they had to pay for it. So again, there was a determination to lead there, and to battle through those difficult conversations, which there were, to help support patients to get the right treatment. And you mentioned the industry at its best. I think HIV is a great example where within a generation, really, the industry had come up with many more treatments. The physicians had understood the disease, and really, in that time and even now, the mortality rate is way, way lower. Its transmission rates are much lower, and that's where I think the industry has committed to solving those problems and led, and delivered outcomes which probably couldn't quite be imagined way back at the beginning.
Yeah, and it seemed to be like a marker of your career. Every, 5, 10 years, you seem to be moving into other products or specialist areas. I've been working in gene therapy, working in some other areas. Do you think that actually having that grounding at that point in your career then got you focused on trying to work within some really cool different technology areas?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's nothing better than working on genuine innovation, where you are helping the community, whatever that is, the medical community, the patient community, to really solve those problems, and treat diseases which have either no treatment at all, or limited treatment, or where you see that, like gene therapy, we see that brand new technology come through and able to really change lives in ways that existing types of medicines really couldn't. We can really supply the body with the gene that it's missing to help produce the protein that helps treat the disease in the long term. Is an amazing thing. And so being on that leading edge, if you want to call it that, is a great place to be, and brings its own challenges, because clearly when you're doing something new, the answers aren't all written down. You have to find the answers, and explore, and find the right way to be successful on behalf of patients.
Yeah, so but what has been really interesting in our discussions is that those foundational steps within some of um, the part of the industry like HIV, moving into rare disease, moving into gene therapy. You've seen lots of these different areas when they're almost like quite fledgling
Mm.
and trying to lead and create teams in that moment. Do you think that using the pride of what you're doing or the importance has really helped you lead in those moments?
Yeah, because I think particularly as you get more into rare diseases, the likelihood is you're going to become aware of individual patients, not their names or their details, but it becomes quite specific because they are rare diseases. You're not dealing with large populations with heart disease or asthma or whatever. And I think at that point you begin to connect what the industry does and what you do within the industry to an individual that can benefit. And I think that's where that kind of motivation, that leadership, that passion, if you like, really begins to show through because it becomes quite specific in that sense. And so gene therapy is a perfect example where we're delivering product for an individual patient with their family and friends and with the potential to really change their life, change the trajectory of their life and their health. And in lots of ways, I don't think you need much more motivation than that. But that's the connection between, for me, that big purpose of the industry and the part that you can play in it in a small way. And that's what drives teams. My team in gene therapy, patients, and we're motivated by that. Even if you go back to early days, I worked on a brand which was neonatal lung surfactant and reduced mortality by 50%. Those things are meaningful, and that's really what pushes you on and gets you out of bed and makes you walk through the difficult challenges that inevitably come with it.
Yeah, and you've had difficult challenges, right? Not everybody's career is, all roses and nice and easy. You've seen leadership at different size organizations, different size teams, and different size complexity. Can we have a discussion around that? How you've actually traversed working at like a Glaxo sized organization to then working in a really agile rare disease space. So let's have a little think about, the differences. Can you explain to the listeners how you've managed to traverse those worlds?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously I did the big Salesforce job first. And that was an interesting challenge in itself because my previous job was in the strategic group at Glaxo. So, phase one, phase two assets, providing the commercial input to that 5 and 10 year plans, and working with countries to flesh out the development plans. Over a weekend, I went from that to then coming into, a front end 200-person sales force in the biggest organization in the UK at that time. And so the challenge of that is two things really. One is it's such a big step in terms of the experience gap that you have to bridge. And so I think you have to prioritize where you think your strengths lie, but also accept that you'll never know everything straight away. And I think the other thing about working at scale is you absolutely understand that you can't control everything. You absolutely understand that the representatives are out there day to day doing their job, but you're really not part of that picture. And so, the mantra for me and the leadership team was, if we can get most of the people doing most of the right things most of the time, we'll be successful. And again, that trust that they will do that because they've got the clarity that they need to be successful and are motivated, is inherent in that, if you like. When you move to rare diseases or smaller therapeutic areas, smaller companies, by definition, you're just more involved. That's the reality of it. Those conversations move quicker, decision making is quicker. Those are realities, and it's not so much about control. It's just about your degree of involvement. Particularly with gene therapy, because we had so many challenges getting products into countries and meeting patient needs and whatever. You were just constantly part of that narrative, and whilst the team were really empowered to do their thing, you just knew more about what was happening every day to day and could support where they needed it. But I think that the reality is the same for both, which is that belief in empowerment is the same whether it's 200 people or 10 people. They have to feel that they're making their contribution, they're making the decisions that can help the business move forward. And your job is to support, guide, and encourage that.
Yeah, and you and I have spoken before about in those smaller environments, actually there is more, sometimes there's more, it's more innovative, more connected, a bit more urgency. How did you find going from the bigger organization where you're kind of giving more trust to then actually being rolling your sleeves up and in the trenches?
Yeah, it is slightly different, but I think my start point is always, the wisdom is in the team. It's not in me, and the more that I can have those conversations, encourage them to bring their ideas, the more likely we are to solve the problems. And I think also, particularly in the gene therapy environment, we were working, incredibly cross-functionally, with manufacturing, with, market access, with customer service, all those different aspects of the business, and they all had their own contribution to make. And so, again, allowing the team to work together and focus on the problem, and allow them to solve that with guidance is the art of it. I think, there was no way, and I suppose I understood this very early on, there was no way I could solve those problems on my own.
Yeah. And also, when you are the commercial guy, that internal leadership is extremely important, not just your team, but being part of something bigger. The tension sometimes between commercial and science can be difficult. As the commercial guy, how did you show R&D, how to get through some of the challenges, because obviously there is a lot of passion, but were you bringing some pragmatism to those conversations?
Well, it's a real challenge because, again, working in the strategic group, we were, working on phase one, phase two assets. One of the big parts of that picture is the commercial value of that drug, or the perceived commercial value of that drug. And I remember working with a group in anti-infectives, who had a really good profile for, a drug, but had a very narrow, therapeutic range, in the sense that, the patient population would be quite small. And the thing that I had to remember always was the drug would work. It would help patients. And actually, the challenge is that it's the internal world that's going to prevent that getting to patients, because actually it's a competitive world for resources. And actually, the forecasts were never going to be big enough to mean that would be allocated the resources we needed. So it was a difficult conversation to have, to say, if you can broaden the spectrum of that medicine, then you will be able to treat more patients. And if you treat more patients, that will be more valuable, and you're likely to make it through the internal hurdles and the, discussions that happen. And to be fair, I think if you're open and honest about the reasons why that medicine might not make it through the internal processes, people are more willing to go back and go, okay, let's have another think about it. And I'm also conscious that for researchers unlike me, that's kind of their life, really. They've spent their university, their PhD, and their working life working to find compounds and drugs that will do a particular thing, and they can't just jump and go from cardiovascular to asthma or rare diseases to then do something different if that's what they want to do. So you have to be respectful of the work that's taken them to that point, as well as being honest about the hurdles that are in front.
Yeah, and the terminology that you've used before is intellectual leadership. So being in that kind of pivot position of this is what the commercial world is saying, this is what R&D and science are saying, and kind of being that conduit in between where you're, as you said, for some people this has been their entire career, and for you sometimes have to have a difficult conversation, but then you've had, things happen really well and things that you thought were going to be really good that have not gone to market in the same way. So, history has given you a lot of lessons.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that conversation is there are things that I've been passionate about as assets to bring in. So again, I remember a very specific example where there was one of the anti-infective franchises that was really coming to an end, it was rapidly genericizing, and we were looking for something that might give an opportunity to extend that. And we found that biotech were a great piece of technology. I was obviously from a commercial point of view very keen. That intellectual leadership with the scientists, whatever, was yes, okay, we're slightly skeptical, but let's go for it. Spent quite a lot of the company's money acquiring it, and then it failed in phase two. And so again, it's about I think the integrity of the thinking, which is to your first point, the willingness to accept on the researchers and the development side that, commercial forecasts and the value of the product matters. But on the commercial side, recognizing that just because you think it's commercially a good idea doesn't mean that it will fly. And you have to hold those two things in tension. And I think, again, when you come back to think about the industry in its broadest sense, what that shows is how good the industry is at finding the products, the drugs that can change diseases and change patients' lives and getting them through all those steps to come to market and actually do what we want them to do in the first place.
Yeah, and also putting the ego at the door, it's winning and it's losing sometimes with that internal stakeholder management, but you're all doing things with purpose and passion for the right reasons.
Yes, exactly. I think that's the other thing, which is you have to believe, and I do believe that everybody comes to work in this industry with the ultimate aim of getting medicines that really change diseases and change people's lives to those patients. The ups and downs and the challenges that come with that are the things that you have to work through. And I'm sure everybody's listening to this knows that there's a huge failure rate in development, and lots of products that just simply don't make it, past even the early stages. So, it is, I think, a real credit in lots of ways that we persevere, that the science leads us forward, and we find new avenues to bring those medicines to patients that change their lives.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about some of that. I think it would be good for some of our listeners maybe to learn from some of the setbacks or the lessons of failure, because it seems as though, you know, you've worked in some really cutting edge parts of the industry that isn't your normal traditional products. So sometimes the data might be shaping decisions now with also an eye on the future. How have you kind of managed through and adapted and persevered through some of these challenges?
Yeah, I think you have to keep focused on where you want to get to. I think one of the great things about science is that failure is always a start point. So you learn something scientifically that then can lead you in a different direction. And ultimately, there are things over the years where particular bits of science or technology have kind of not quite made it at first and then have come back. And probably the perfect example of that most recently is the mRNA vaccines for COVID. mRNA vaccines were really seen as a side water, and not that interesting to the industry. But come the point where the world needed the industry to step up, that technology came to the fore, and ultimately the person who did most work on it won the Nobel Prize. And so, that's a great example of where the science never really finishes, but usually there's a time and a place when it can come back, and be like what it was always intended to be, which is useful to patients and treating diseases.
Yeah, and there's actually a bit of a undertone that might happen a bit more in the next 5 to 10 years, that you know older science might come back to the fore in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that is the joy of science. Those technologies that, I mean, even gene therapy at the moment, people are questioning whether that's really going to be a long-term approach or whatever. And I've never really known the industry to completely give up on a new way of doing things, scientifically, and I really believe that ultimately those bits of science which are maybe not front and center now, will come back to the fore. But also when you look at just the breadth of the science at the moment and where people are looking, to treat cancer, therapeutic vaccines, all kinds of different, approaches to managing disease. It is extraordinary and almost impossible to keep up with them. And one of those will lead, and then others will undoubtedly follow.
Yeah, and didn't you have, when you were working a few years ago, didn't you have some clinical trials that failed, but the data then generated something amazing in its field anyway later on down the line?
Yeah, so we were working. I worked for a company where the idea was to take existing products, but then find new indications for them in rare diseases. And we were exploring three autoimmune diseases with this compound. We were a startup company, and all three trials failed. So the immediate consequence of that was having to lay people off, which obviously is quite difficult. But actually, the data was rich enough and good enough to help physicians understand that that product had a place, even though it couldn't be registered because we didn't have the data. But then a subsequent biotech company took up the idea, learnt from the clinical trials, and then developed a compound, which a couple of years ago was then brought to market and approved for one of those autoimmune diseases and lupus. So again, that sense of failure, whilst it was very kind of hurtful to all of us in that company, because we wanted to be successful and bring that product to patients, ultimately ended up with physicians understanding more and being able to use that product more effectively, despite not being approved, and ultimately led to approval down the line somewhere.
Yeah, and that's the purpose that we spoke about earlier, and being part of a connected industry like this to still feel like a win or an impact, many years later on with a different organization. Yeah, that's great. And you and I have spoken about, your role being very interesting, where you have been part of a leadership team at the intersection of science, commercial scale up, but then also, very importantly, global ambition. So you've got all of these different push and pull factors. How have you, managed to curate your career in that space? I'm really, really interested for our listeners to learn, whether it's launching or scaling or pivoting. How have you seen success, or what kind of foundations do you build in order to be successful in that space?
First thing is you have to have a certain amount of personal ambition. So you want to be successful for yourself, and that's not entirely selfish because that's a learning process. Being dropped into new things is exciting, and you want to have the ambition to do that, and hopefully that rubs off on people that you're working with. I think the scale up thing is fascinating because that's about designing an organization that can be effective and then bringing people into that organization who have the skills, experience, personalities even to then make that successful. And again, that's where I think you come back to that kind of empowerment and agility. You need that in all organizations, but as you scale things, we used to joke about building the plane as we flew, and there is that sense, and that's the exciting bit for me in many ways. The sense that it's not all written down, that there isn't a process around it, and you have to work it out. And I think what you get in those circumstances is a much clearer sense of the priorities, a much better sense of making decisions with imperfect information, a better understanding and management of risk, where you are potentially taking risks rather than possibly being prevented from taking risks. In bigger organizations. And in bigger organizations, there's just more bandwidth. There are just more brains looking at any particular situation, both positively and negatively, to work through. particularly in gene therapy and the startup company, there are only limited amounts of people. So you have to look at what's in front of you and with the best, discussion, the best interest of everybody involved, come to a conclusion and then act.
Yeah, and what about in that specific type of organization, so smaller, more agile, dynamic, what do you think are the key personality traits that you're looking for as a commercial leader in that space?
I'm definitely looking for people who are willing to take risks. At first, intellectually, so willing to have ideas, willing to question what's happened before or what we're planning to do so we can make it better. I'm also looking for people who are, once we reach a consensus of what we're going to do, are willing to then focus and do that. Frankly, even if they disagreed. One of my things about teams that I like working with is I like people who are diverse in their opinions and experience so that we really create a dynamic of discussion and questioning and even occasionally argument, quite frankly. But what I also try and create is a team where once we've had that decision made, however it's made, either by consensus or otherwise, then actually we go and do what we said we would do, and then we come back and look at it and go, okay, did it work? What can we learn? How do we get better from there? And so, that big debate up front, I think, is a little more prevalent in smaller companies, probably because people feel perhaps more able to bring their ideas in smaller companies and have them heard, and there are less voices around. So I think you get um, just a slightly more robust discussion in some ways, which is more forward thinking and directed at doing things and trying. And that really is for me. You have to go and try. It's not an intellectual job. It's a job about deciding and then doing and then assessing and then adjusting.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, take risks, have ideas, action orientated, but having that diverse and dynamic debate, but nothing's personal.
No, no, absolutely not. But I think that's where, again, harping back slightly to the beginning of the conversation, that works best when people are trusting each other, where there is integrity to that discussion, and where the focus is on the outcome. So, what helps us be successful, but actually what helps us get that product to patients, whether it's through market access or whatever situation you're in, what's the purpose of the team and the discussion, and how do we follow that through? Yes, to create our own success, but ultimately to create the outcome that we want for patients.
Yeah, and as we'll talk now about the future of leadership and future of the industry, but I think it's quite an important topic where, you know, we're entering a new age of technology with AI and lots of different aspects where actually the human side of leadership is going to become more and more important, in my opinion. So, what's your thoughts on like the future of leadership within this industry?
Yeah, I think AI will change things for sure. Exactly how much and how quickly, I think, is still to be determined. And I think the leadership aspect of that is being intellectually critical of what AI may be telling you. So that sense of, yes, that's what it says, but is that what I believe to be true? And how do we take that and turn it into something that then is truly, truly valuable? AI at the moment, makes us, a few mistakes, let's say, as well as getting a few things right. And I think it's that intellectual rigor, if you like, in leadership. But also with all these things, whether it's science or AI or whatever, ultimately it's human beings that turn them into successes and teams that take that information, however it's generated, and turn that into successes. And the reality is, for the most part, when you get to the commercial end of things, nobody will worry too much about whether the product was created by a moment of genius by a scientist or by AI. What we'll be interested in is let's get it to patients and let's change lives.
Yeah, love that. And what about the future of the industry? So that's the leadership aspect. What are you most excited about? Because you work in some pretty cool parts of the industry.
Yeah, I think the personalization, if you like, of medicine, or maybe the individualization of medicine, is now becoming very interesting. I think. I remember way back when the human genome was first codified, everybody thought that was going to be revolutionary, and it's beginning to become so, but it's taken a while. And I think some of those personalization elements and the things that allow you to know that a particular drug will act in a particular way to produce the most benefit for an individual patient is really exciting, both because the patient gets the most benefit, but also everybody else benefits. The healthcare system uses its resources in the best way it possibly can. The industry gets the credit for producing a medicine that really does that. And as an individual working in the industry, you feel like you're helping patients, potentially quite specifically. So I think that's, over the next 10 to 20 years, it'll be really interesting to see where that ultimately progresses to. I think some of the new technologies, gene therapy is the start of it, but there are many, many other ways that people are looking at, treating cancer and other diseases using, the immune system to internally to the body. I think that's a really interesting area. So, I think the most fascinating thing for me in many ways is just the breadth of the science and the approaches that some of the almost like the molecular level science has brought. We're no longer just talking about small molecules and the occasional biological. We're working at a whole different level of specificity, and I think that's incredibly exciting to see what the industry can do with that.
Yeah, cost of goods. If we can get that cost of goods down, that's going to be the key that unlocks it.
In part, but the thing that will unlock it is the benefit that patients receive and the healthcare system receive. Cost of goods is a challenge for the companies. Nobody outside of our world really cares, quite honestly. But actually, if you, as we found with gene therapy, with a very expensive sticker price, but actually the long-term benefit of that and the fundamental way in which it works becomes really important in terms of both the healthcare system and the patients. And I think what we've seen over time is that the world of the physician and the healthcare systems begin to adapt to it. It's slow, but they do because they begin to see more value from it.
Yeah, and it's funny, the politicizing of gene therapy as an example. Very recently, there was an FDA roundtable that was then, in pretty much every newspaper around the world because of the outcome of some amazing people really passionately talking about their part of the industry and, the government in America saying, do you know what? Let's go for it. Let's back it.
Yeah, I think that was, an important event, for sure. But I think again, my own experience tells me, with gene therapy that, when physicians and healthcare systems begin to see what happens in practice and they hear the stories of patients, then that begins to make them think differently about what that particular technology can do. And I think in some ways the world of social media and the platforms that families and patients have to tell their stories, is a real positive as well because they can explain what they individually experience in practice, for both positively and negatively. So the industry has to accept that, there are always challenges with new medicines as well as, great successes. But those things, become much more ambient, as you say. Yes, they can be politicized, but also they can work in our favor because we are demonstrating as an industry with those types of technologies that we can do things for patients that we could never really do before.
Yeah, love it. And finally, what piece of advice would you give to any commercial leaders out there in the rare disease, gene therapy, CGT space? Is there any advice that you'd give?
I think the general advice I'd give to anybody actually is in the end, it's all about people. So whether you are those people are patients, whether those people are your customers, whether they're your internal stakeholders or your team, ultimately, you know, I can look at my career and say I've achieved very little, which was uniquely down to me. Almost everything that's been achieved has been achieved by people that I've worked with. And so, invest in those relationships, invest in those people skills, because that's really what will move things forward. I mean, specifically in rare diseases, I think it really is just keep very focused on the patient, finding them, helping them, treating them, supporting the families and whatever, because that is, there's a sense of community around that, which I think is very valuable, and allows you to, again, as I said before, see that what you do has an impact at quite an individual level rather than a population level. And that, when times are tough, that definitely gets me out of bed in the morning.
Love it. Derek, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Really, really impressive story. And I love that trust, integrity, empowerment, problem solving, agility, adaptability, all of those things you spoke about at the beginning have weaved their way through so many of the different challenges and successes that you've had. I'm sure the listeners will absolutely love this episode. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you, Tom. It's been a real pleasure.